Conversations about consent are important, especially in entertainment where one scene could change the perception of the audience entirely. This is why Consent Labs, an Australian nonprofit, wants to introduce a classification that highlights the lack of consent in movies and shows while also citing recent and old examples of where it could have been used. What's led to this campaign and why it is relevant is what we'll talk about in this video. Let's start with the details of Consent Labs' petition. So it all started with a study by an organization in Australia where they showed some intimate scenes from movies and TV shows to over 1,000 people between 18 and 44. The results weren't super encouraging though, because after watching these scenes, 3 out of 5 people couldn't identify the lack of consent in them. This means about 57% of the people thought what they were watching was fully consensual, even if it wasn't. This includes the main kiss between the prince and Sleeping Beauty while she sleeps, and a scene from The Devil Wears Prada where Simon Baker's Christian keeps insisting on Anne Hathaway's Andrea, who's drunk by the way, to kiss him repeatedly even when she says she can't. So you see how problematic it could be to show such scenes without a consent classification, especially considering the kind of role movies and shows play in setting standards of action in real life. Based on all this, the lab is campaigning with a petition called Classify Consent, where they're asking creators to either show explicit verbal agreement in scenes or classify where the act's non-consensual. As per the petition, if scenes of violence and coarse language can be classified because they have an impact on the audience, so should those of non-consent. We agree, and next we'll be talking about some scenes that prove why this petition is super relevant in this day and age. First off, we have Bridgerton. This show's had its fair share of praise and controversy, and if you've watched it at all, you'll know why. And while praise for Bridgerton includes its portrayal of female pleasure, there's one scene where the show really toes the line, making it a tad bit problematic. So, you remember that part where Daphne prevents Simon from pulling out, right? It was after she finds out about his aversion to having a family and takes matters into her own hands to change that. Yeah, not the best examples of consensual sex in recent television. And it's not like the show justified the act in any way. In fact, it was actually a negative turning point in their relationship, if anything. But just the fact that this scene was aired begs to consider 2 questions. 1, why did the writers have to show this scene in such an explicit manner? And if it was necessary to the plot, why didn't they add a trigger warning to inform users of what was coming ahead? The audience did call out the show for portraying the scene this way and called it rape, saying that it questioned the need for consent for all genders, and Lizzie Talbot, intimacy coordinator of the show, agrees. Again, we know the scene was a plot obstacle Simon and Daphne needed to get to the end, but even if it was needed, the conversation it sparked also highlights the need for consent classification in shows where it matters the most. Then we have the one with the kisses. Yes, we're talking about Friends. Now, the show may have been a record breaker and a beacon of comfort television in its time, but recently it's sparked debate for a lot of problematic content shown in it, whether it's the blatant homophobia targeted towards Ross's ex-wife and Chandler's dad, Joey's habit of objectifying women, Monica's neurotic emotional turmoil frequently towing the line of emotional abuse, or the general lack of growth in some of the characters' parts. The show can be called a bit of a mess in today's context, and no laugh tracks great enough to cover that. But here, we're about to discuss a scene that may have been branded as cute and quirky at the time of airing, and even today. You know that phrase in the show where Chandler and Monica are hiding their relationship from the rest of the gang? There's a scene where they kiss right when some of their friends walk in, so Chandler proceeds to kiss Rachel and Phoebe as well to cover up their accidental reveal. Not the best example of consensual kissing either. Guys, remember kids, you cannot just kiss anyone you want just because they're your friends and you're desperate to keep your very serious relationship a secret. And that's not the only scene where it happens. There's also the one where Ross sees Rachel naked in her apartment and goes over thinking it's a sexual invitation. And are we forgetting their obsession with ugly naked guy? Not cool, friends. Up next, there's a recent scene from The Umbrella Academy, including one that Reddit has been rife about, and it's from the latest season of The Umbrella Academy. So after the gang time travels back from Dallas and Allison realizes she can't have her family back again, she goes on a villain rampage, alienating Victor, killing Harlan, and in a particular scene, rumoring Luther to kiss her knowing he's in love with Sloane. That scene's uncomfortable to watch on so many levels. For one, it's totally non-consensual because even if Allison and Luther were a thing in the past, he's clearly not into her anymore. Plus, can we talk about the power dynamics here? Allison Allison's clearly more powerful and knows Luther's been neglected most of his adult life, making him vulnerable. She still doesn't stop and makes him kiss her to prove a point, which makes our skin crawl. And sure, the creators did intend to show the scene to establish a negative arc for Allison, but our question is back, did they have to go that way? And if they did, and it's really a stepping stone in creating a villain arc for the actor, couldn't they show a consent warning to at least warn users about what was coming ahead? Now look, telling stories is important, and with the accessibility of streaming media, there's a whole market that thrives on these stories. Plus, these shows and movies always serve a lesson to their viewers, raising questions about morality, individual actions, consequences, and whatnot. But guys, while stories are important, it's also necessary to tell people what they should be expecting or understanding from them. And look, some viewers know. We, being adults, get it that while the prince kissing Aurora in Sleeping Beauty was part of the story, it isn't the exact fairy tale women would want for themselves today. More than that, it isn't the lesson we'd want to teach our kids who are actually the audience of the movie. Honestly, eternal slumber aside, nobody wants a stranger entering their safe space and kissing them while they slept. But hey, we have some good examples as well. Now, we know we've tattled on Sleeping Beauty too much, but fortunately, while this movie doesn't get the idea of consent on point, another one does. We're talking about Frozen. There's a scene in its sequel where Anna presents Kristoff with a new sled and he lifts her up, twirls her around, and says, "I could kiss you," but then puts her down and asks her if he can. This is exactly what kids today need to learn when it comes to intimate behavior. Props to Frozen for getting it right. There's also Sex Education. That's probably a landmark show when it comes to conversations about sexual activity in teenagers. Whether it's abortion, accepting your identity, exploring different sexual orientations, or choosing to say no, the show's big on lessons. But what's the great thing about this is that it isn't preachy about them. And one of the biggest things they focus on is saying no in a relationship. Eric and Adam's relationship is a great example of that, because as Adam starts accepting his sexuality and gets together with Eric, there are a lot of times when both of them speak out their consent for either holding each other's hands, going out, or even having sex, showing how consent and communication can make a healthy dynamic for you. There's also Otis, who, as the school's unofficial sex guide, tells his peers time and time again how saying no really does mean no. And even if you do your best, sometimes things don't work out because you can't engineer a relationship. Also, not forget Amy's public bus incident, which leads to a very wholesome plot of all the girls talking about their experiences that are too real for fiction, highlighting how important consent is in even the slightest touch between two people. This is why the show's probably one of the few that gets its messaging right. And this brings us back to Consent Lab's campaign that also asks that shows and movies either show consent spoken out verbally or show a consent classification if the plot requires the scene to be acted out. Because if we are to create a safe space for people to accept healthy intimacy, such messages are not only important, they're needed. That's a wrap for this video. What's your take on the Classify Consent campaign by the Australian Institute? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channels for more videos like this. See you in the next one.